faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today I'll be interpreting the book called The Gates of Europe for You, Ukraine, a 2,000-year history, authored by Serhii Plokhy, an American professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University and director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And now I'm Mike Bagley. Serhii Plokhy, which country is the largest in Europe by area?
I bet you'd blurt out Russia.
Then what about the second largest? Many people look confused. Germany, France, Spain, none are correct. The answer is Ukraine. Ukraine has a land area of 603,700 square kilometers, which is 2.4 times the size of the UK. Ukraine is a major country in Europe with an area twice that of Poland. It's also the world's second largest grain exporter and ranks fourth globally in education level. And despite these impressive metrics, Ukraine's presence has always been relatively weak. In ancient times, it was long under the spheres of influence of major powers like the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, Poland, Lithuania, and the Commonwealth. In modern times, it has been overshadowed by Russia, even called Little Russia. Take a familiar example. The Soviet novel How the Steel Was Tempered influenced generations of Chinese, but many don't realize that the author Ostrovsky was Ukrainian, and the main plot unfolds in Ukraine. In fact, it's a work depicting the situation of Ukrainians around the October Revolution. But during dissemination, it was deliberately labeled as Soviet Russian literature, downplaying its Ukrainian essence. Ukrainians would emphasize that Ukraine is Ukraine, Russia is Russia. The two differ greatly in history, culture, ethnicity, psychology, and social customs. For a long time, Ukrainians have been building their own identity to break free from external control. Today, the book, The Gates of Europe, Ukraine's 2,000-year history, we're discussing details, the struggles of Ukrainians, and Ukraine's complex relationships with neighboring powers. It's worth noting that the author himself is of Ukrainian descent, with a deep understanding of Ukrainian aspirations, which is a key feature of this book. I'll divide the book into 5 parts to discuss. Part 1, Early History, from the Scythians to the Slavs. Part 2, The Birth of Kyivan Rus out of destruction. Part 3, Gaining freedom between Poland and Tsarist Russia. Part 4, The Shadow of Empire and Conflicts with Russia. Part 5, A Mix of Joy and Sorrow, Europe's Grain Basket Through Trials. Okay, let's begin now. Part 1, Early History, from the Scythians to the Slavs. Ukraine is located in Eastern Europe, bordered by the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov to the south, Russia to the east, Belarus to the north, and Poland, Romania, and other countries to the west. Ukraine's terrain consists of plains, forests, and mountains, with numerous rivers, the most representative being the Dnieper River. It flows from north to south into the Black Sea, dividing Ukraine into eastern and western parts. The banks of the Dnieper River are vast and fertile black soil, easy to cultivate with high grain yields. Such a lush area, with few natural barriers, naturally attracts surrounding tribes. Archaeology shows that as early as thousands of years ago, a group of agricultural settlers appeared in southwestern Ukraine. After that, nomadic tribes originating from northern Eurasia continuously poured in. A typical example is the Scythians, who originated in the Volga River basin, belonged to the Iranian language family, and lived as nomads. Later, the Scythians continuously migrated westward into Ukraine, with some settling down to become farmers, while others maintained their nomadic traditions. They were herders. The two sides formed a cooperative relationship. And simply put, farmers grew agricultural products like wheat, onions, lentils, which were then resold by herders to other places. To whom? The ancient Greeks in the 6th century BC crossed the Turkish Straits into the Black Sea, landed in southern Ukraine, and established several colonies. This brought them into contact with the Scythians. The ancient Greeks were naturally skilled at trade. They bought many things from the Scythians and continuously transported them back to the Greek peninsula. Along with the goods, they also brought back knowledge and stories. Knowledge and anecdotes about the Scythians and Ukraine were written down by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus in his book, The Histories. Herodotus recorded that the banks of the Dnieper River had the most lush grasslands and the sweetest water, beautiful and fertile. This became the initial impression of Ukraine for Europeans. However, the Scythians couldn't rule here forever because Ukraine has no natural defenses, making it easy for external forces to enter. Thus, Ukraine's rulers changed constantly, like a revolving door, reaching a climax around the 4th century AD. At that time, the nomadic tribes of the Huns, originating from the Mongolian plateau, migrated westward on a large scale. Under the pressure from the Huns, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and others also moved westward. They crossed the Ukrainian steppes in droves, surging toward the wealthier Roman Empire. This was the barbarian invasions that profoundly impacted European history. The barbarian invasions drastically reshaped Europe's ethnic distribution pattern. For example, the Anglo-Saxon, originating from present-day northern Germany, crossed the English Channel and came to rule the British Isles. Meanwhile, Slavs originating from present-day Poland gradually split into 3 major branches. One branch remained in Eastern Europe as West Slavs. Another moved south into the Balkan Peninsula, becoming South Slavs. The third branch moved east into what's now the Ukrainian steppe, customarily called East Slavs. By around 500 AD, Ukraine had largely become the domain of the East Slavs. Historical records show over a dozen Slavic tribes spread across the vast lands of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. They lived simply, practiced primitive religions, and had customs that seemed bizarre to outsiders. For instance, Slavs typically had sexual experience before marriage and took pride in it. If the husband discovered his wife was still a virgin on their wedding night, he'd consider her lacking charm and send her back to her parents. To Christian Western Europeans, this seemed utterly barbaric and backward. Of course, Slavs didn't care about others' opinions. They lived in log houses, farmed, raised livestock, and thrived on the black soil. Today's Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, was also built during this period. Legend has it that 4 siblings sailed to the middle reaches of the Dnieper River, found the location geographically excellent, and decided to settle. They named their new home Kyiv after the eldest brother, Kyi. These 4 siblings are considered Kyiv's earliest founders. Kyiv connected the Baltic Sea to the north and the Black Sea to the south, linking Russia and the Middle East with Western Europe. From this perspective, Ukraine with Kyiv at its core truly served as Eurasia's transportation hub. In the author's words, it was the gates of Europe, occupied by the East Slavs. For the next 1,500 years, all their tragedies and triumphs stemmed from this unique geopolitical position. In Part 2, I'll recount Ukraine's birth. From the Kyivan Rus to the Cossack hetmanate, in the mid-9th century, another group of outsiders invaded Ukraine, the Vikings from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, long engaged in sea raids as Norse pirates. In the year 859, a Viking fleet sailed into the Mediterranean Sea and raided Asia Minor. This region belonged to the Byzantine Empire at that time. To defend their territory, Byzantine Emperor Michael personally led a large army against the Vikings in 860. Another group of Vikings landed on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, fought their way to Kyiv, then sailed south along the Dnieper River, crossed the Black Sea, entered the Bosporus Strait, and launched a surprise attack on Constantinople, the Byzantine capital. At that moment, the main forces of the Byzantine Empire were still in Asia Minor and couldn't return in time for defense. However, Constantinople's walls were tall and strong, preventing the Vikings from breaking through. Eventually, they plundered the suburbs and left triumphantly. Early in terms of results, this raid was mediocre, but through it the Vikings recognized Kyiv's strategic importance. From here, they could easily access the Black Sea and threaten the wealthiest regions of the Byzantine Empire. So the Vikings began competing for control of Kyiv. By the late 9th century, they had largely taken control of Kyiv and conquered the surrounding Slavic tribes through a conquest filled with intrigue and violence. For example, the Vikings demanded tribute from Slavic tribes, starting with 1 marten pelt per person annually, then gradually increasing demands. The Slavs, overwhelmed, rebelled. The Vikings said they could negotiate, invited the Slavic tribal leaders to Kyiv, and burned them alive. They relied on such brutal methods. The Vikings consolidated their rule, and the Slavs lamented, "Being enslaved is our fate." However, there was another side. As outsiders, the Vikings were a minority and had to interact with Slavs, even intermarrying. Over time, the two groups merged into the Rus people, and the state they created became known as Kyivan Rus. The term Rus comes from Slavic, meaning rowers, a vivid description of the Vikings' seafaring identity. Of course, Kyivan Rus rulers no longer needed piracy, having found better livelihoods. Trading with the Byzantine Empire, Kyivan Rus signed trade agreements, selling grain, honey, furs, and importing luxuries like silk and porcelain. Byzantium also gave Kyivan Rus an intangible asset, legitimacy. Kyivan Rus' supreme ruler was called the Grand Prince of Kyiv, nominally governing from the Baltic to the Black Sea. He actually couldn't effectively control many areas. Due to frequent infighting, the Grand Prince's position was unstable. In such circumstances, the Grand Prince of Kyiv needed the Byzantine Emperor's authority to stabilize the situation. How to achieve that? The answer is through marriage alliances. The problem was, the Byzantine Emperor considered himself heir to the Roman Empire with noble bloodline. How could he look favorably upon a Grand Prince of Kyiv with pirate origins? Fortunately, an opportunity arose. In 987 AD, internal strife broke out in Byzantium. Emperor Basil II had no choice but to seek help from Kyivan Rus. Grand Prince Vladimir personally led troops to quell the rebellion. For this service, Vladimir married Basil II's sister, abandoned his pagan religion, and converted to the Byzantine state religion, Orthodox Christianity. This move had profound impacts on Ukraine. First, it meant Ukraine was accepted into the Christian world. After Vladimir's son Yaroslav succeeded him, he actively pursued marriage alliances across Europe. He married the Swedish king's daughter and strategically arranged his children's marriages. 2 sons. One married a Byzantine princess, the other wed the Polish king's sister. 3 daughters married the kings of France, Norway, and Hungary, respectively. These alliances elevated the Grand Prince of Kyiv into European royalty, vastly improving their status. Yaroslav became known as Europe's father-in-law. Meanwhile, the Orthodox Patriarch established Kyiv as a metropolitan see, equivalent to a regional religious leader. Thus, Kyiv gained authority over all religious affairs in Ukraine, formally cementing its status as Ukraine's most important city. Corresponding church buildings rose one after another, most notably the St. Sophia Cathedral, sharing its name with Constantinople's Hagia Sophia. Architects, engineers, and stonemasons were specially invited from Byzantium. The cathedral featured 5 naves, 5 thick semicircular apses, 3 galleries, and 13 domes. Its walls were built with granite and quartzite, while the ceilings displayed frescoes and mosaics. Anyone entering this cathedral was awestruck. The magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral both established Orthodox religious authority and symbolized the Grand Prince's legitimacy. The spread of Christianity also elevated Kyivan Rus' knowledge base. Locals originally had no writing system. Even the Grand Princes were illiterate. For example, Yarlov himself barely recognized letters and couldn't write his own name. Byzantine missionaries addressed this by creating Church Slavonic, enabling the ruling class to read Christian scriptures, marking the beginning of literacy in Kyivan Rus. By the 1000s, locally born historians compiled the first Kyivan chronicle. In short, With Christianization, Kyivan Rus flourished. French envoys even declared it more unified, powerful, and populous than France after their visit. This wasn't entirely French exaggeration. At its peak, Kyivan Rus encompassed most of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and the European part of Russia. Regrettably, all three modern nations claim Kyivan Rus as their origin. Alas, this golden age ended when Yaroslav died in 1054. His descendants fought brutally for the Grand Prince's throne, plunging Kyivan Rus into chaos. Statistics show 24 Grand Princes in just 1 century, most seizing power through coups. This turmoil fueled regional warlords' rise. Western Galicia, northern Chernihiv, and farther north, Smolensk, all gained de facto independence. Unified Kyivan Rus vanished, replaced by fragmented fiefdoms. But the final blow came from the Mongols. In 1235, the Mongol Empire launched its second Western campaign. Their cavalry swept from Central Asia, winning battle after battle. Key strongholds like Moscow, Rostov, and Ryazan fell one by one. On December 7, 1240, Mongols stormed Kyiv, burning, killing, looting without restraint. That day became Kyivan Rus' death knell. This nation, once envied by France, was utterly destroyed by the Mongols. My narrative now moves to part 3, gaining freedom. Between Poland and Tsarist Russia, Kyivan Rus' collapse brought two consequences. First, Kyiv's status plummeted dramatically. The Mongols established the Golden Horde, covering most of modern Ukraine and Russia, with Ukraine at the empire's western frontier. Thus, to the Mongols, Ukraine was literally a borderland. In fact, Ukraine derives from Mongolian, meaning border. As mere frontier, Kyiv lost importance, so the Golden Horde centered its rule not on the Dnieper, but further east, along the Volga River. In 1299, the Metropolitan See relocated from Kiev, first to Vladimir, then permanently to Moscow. From then on, Moscow replaced Kyiv as the religious center of the East Slavs. The second consequence of Kyivan Rus' demise, it left a massive power vacuum filled by external forces. First to exploit this were the Lithuanians from the Baltic Sea region. In 1240, precisely when Kyivan Rus fell, that year, Lithuanians established their Grand Duchy. By the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde declined. The Lithuanian Grand Duchy seized the chance to expand into Belarus and Ukraine, capturing Kyiv. Right afterward, they pushed south along the Dnieper to the Black Sea coast. Then came the Poles. Poland, west of Ukraine, began as a Grand Duchy before becoming a kingdom in the early 11th century. In 1340, Poland invaded Ukraine, annexing Galicia. Thus, Ukraine was partitioned between Poland and Lithuania. But more dramatic events followed. In 1385, Poland and Lithuania signed an agreement merging into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Commonwealth redivided lands, Belarus to Lithuania, Ukraine to Poland, meaning Polish rule. But Poland was Catholic. To them, Orthodox Christianity was practically heresy. To spread Catholicism, Poles decreed that only converted Ukrainian nobles could enjoy privileges. Simultaneously, they forcibly promoted Latin and Polish to replace Slavic languages, sparking fierce backlash. Some Ukrainian nobles plotted to assassinate the Polish king. The plan failed. Ringleaders arrested, participants fled abroad. With elites gone, Kyivan Rus' lifestyle and cultural traditions faded into obscurity. Yet Polish rule over Ukraine wasn't secure. They faced formidable challenges from the east. As mentioned earlier, after Kyivan Rus' fall, Moscow became the East Slavs' political and religious center. In 1476, Grand Prince Ivan III declared independence from the Golden Horde, breaking Mongol rule. But Ivan III aimed higher. Claiming Kyivan Rus' legacy, he vowed to unify Rus lands, meaning conquering Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV, continued this mission. In 1547, he proclaimed himself Tsar, known as Ivan the Terrible, renaming the realm Tsardom of Russia. Russia, translated as the Emperor of all Russia. Of course, Ivan the Terrible's concept of Russia included all of Kyivan Rus, which clashed with Poland, leading to repeated tug-of-wars over territories like Ukraine. For the first 100-plus years, Poland dominated. They exploited Ivan the Terrible's death and Russia's internal chaos to seize vast lands. Polish forces even captured Moscow once, installing a puppet czar. The Tsar. By the mid to late 17th century, as Tsarist Russia's power surpassed Poland's, the tables turned. Poland grew increasingly passive. Watching Poland and Russia fight over their homeland, how did Ukrainians respond? In short, using Russia against Poland to regain freedom, most visibly through the Cossacks. What are the Cossacks? Since the mid-13th century, Slavs fleeing Mongol rule settled along the lower Dnieper, surviving through herding and fishing. Over centuries, landless peasants and urban poor joined them, merging into a group called Cossacks, meaning free people. Poles both used and suppressed the Cossacks, forming Cossack regiments for their own purposes, yet they strictly controlled troop numbers to prevent Cossack empowerment. But the Poles miscalculated. In spring 1648, Cossack noble Bohdan Khmelnytsky led an uprising, historically called the Great Revolt.
Facing fierce Cossack cavalry, Polish armies suffered defeats, even losing Kyiv.
The next year, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth struck a deal with the Cossacks. 3 eastern provinces, Kyiv, Poltava, Chernihiv, became the Cossack hetmanate under Khmelnytsky. Poland lost vast territories, leaving millions resentful. Khmelnytsky knew this well. His solution: align with Russia. In 1654, Cossacks pledged allegiance to the Tsar, offering military service. Khmelnytsky aimed to trade loyalty for Russian support against Poland. And he saw an alliance, but was naive. To the Tsar, this meant Cossack submission, making them imperial subjects. The Cossack hetmanate and all Ukraine became Russia's territory. As for Ukrainian opinions, the Tsar didn't care. Afterward, under joint attacks from Tsarist Russia and the Cossacks, Poles retreated step by step. By the early 18th century, Russian control covered the entire eastern bank of the Dnieper, modern eastern Ukraine. As they say, no harm comes without comparison. Only then did Ukrainians realize, compared to Poles, the Tsar's rule was more cunning and brutal. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a classic feudal state. Lords fulfilled tribute or military obligations, and the king rarely interfered in their affairs. Thus, Ukrainian nobles enjoyed considerable autonomy. Religiously, Poland briefly pushed Catholicism, but soon adopted tolerance. Orthodox faced no discrimination, and many Jews fled persecution from Western Europe to Ukraine, securing religious freedom. So, Tsarist Russia was the opposite, implementing absolute autocracy. The Tsar held all power, local autonomy was unthinkable. Though Orthodox was the state religion, it demanded all believers obey the Patriarch. And since the Patriarch obeyed the Tsar, this gave him spiritual control over Orthodox followers, while heretics faced persecution. Under Polish rule, some Ukrainians converted to Catholicism. Now they suffered discrimination and persecution, losing religious freedom. Worst was serfdom. Historically, Ukrainian peasants were mostly free, even if temporarily farming for landlords due to debt. Repaying restored freedom. Cossacks were especially famed for cherishing freedom. Russian serfdom showed no mercy. Once enslaved, it was lifelong and hereditary. Landlords controlled life or death with no hope of escape. Under Catherine the Great, serfdom was imposed on Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of free peasants became serfs. By then, Ukrainian regret came too late. In 1772, Russia, Prussia, and Austria executed the first partition of Poland. Former Polish-Ukrainian lands split, some to Austria, some to Russia. Building on this, Catherine the Great established a Ukrainian province, abolished the Cossack hetmanate, absorbed it into the province, and drafted Cossacks into the Russian army as elite troops. In Tsarist Russia's wars, like the Russo-French, Russo-Turkish, and Russo-Japanese conflicts, Cossack cavalry were always present. This bred increasingly complex feelings toward Russia among Cossacks. On one hand, their interests and fate were tightly bound to Russia, creating a shared destiny of honor and disgrace. And
On the other, they resented being used as pawns by the Tsar, sacrificing themselves for Russia. And not just Cossacks.
other Ukrainians also had deeply tangled relationships with Russia. Part 4, Empire's Shadow and Conflicts with Russia, explores this issue. Russia's rule over Ukraine had dual aspects. Positively, it drove modernization and integration into global markets. Negatively, Ukraine became so dependent on Russia that it lost autonomy and uniqueness. I'll dissect this duality through economics and culture, education.
First, economics.
For centuries, Ukraine's open steppes suffered nomadic raids. Tsarist rule eliminated this threat entirely. Simultaneously, the empire encouraged Russian peasants to migrate and cultivate Ukrainian land, sparking an immigration wave. The 1897 census showed 17 million Ukrainians and 3 million Russians in Ukraine, mostly immigrants, including future Soviet leaders. Khrushchev and Brezhnev descended from Russian immigrants to Ukraine. Peace plus labor influx boosted farm yields, making Ukraine Russia's breadbasket. From the mid-19th century, Tsarist Russia attracted European investments, benefiting Ukraine too. 197. British entrepreneur John Hughes arrived in southern Ukraine with metallurgy machinery and nearly 100 skilled miners and workers. They built factories and trained locals, launching Ukraine's industrialization. Today's industrial hubs like Donetsk and Kharkiv developed during this era. To transport Ukrainian goods, Russia built railways, first connecting Moscow to Kyiv. Lines then extended from Kyiv to major Eastern European cities, Warsaw, and key Black Sea ports. By the early 20th century, Ukraine's total railway length exceeded 16,000 kilometers. Through railways, Ukrainian products flowed continuously to Europe and even across oceans to North America, especially agricultural goods like wheat, corn, and soybeans. Praised for high quality, Ukraine earned the title Europe's breadbasket. Economic prosperity fueled urban growth. Kyiv became Russia's third largest city, with 250,000 residents. Odessa transformed from a 20,000-person town into a metropolis of 630,000 inhabitants. But many Ukrainians felt they never reaped development benefits. For instance, Ukraine accounted for 75% of Tsarist exports, earning huge foreign currency. Yet most funds were taken by Russia for royal or elite expenses or Russian businesses, leaving Ukrainians little. And culturally, Russia founded 2 universities in Ukraine, Kharkiv and Kyiv universities, pioneering higher education. Kyiv University, Ukraine's first comprehensive university, cultivated countless talents. Mykola Kostomarov, founder of Ukrainian historiography, and Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's first internationally renowned painter, both graduated from here.
However, Ukrainian schools taught exclusively in Russian with identical curricula, deliberately diluting Ukrainian identity to enforce Russification.
When founding Kyiv University, Tsar Nicholas I explicitly called it a bastion of Russian national culture. In other words, to Tsarist Russia, Ukrainian culture was merely Russian culture's appendage, best erased through assimilation. This goal succeeded partially. Take writers. Nikolai Gogol, born in rural Ukraine, 1809, showed literary genius early. After school, he went to Moscow, becoming a literary titan. Gogol lived mostly in Russia, writing masterpieces like Dead Souls and The Government Inspector in Russian. Another writer, Mikhail Bulgakov, born 1991, studied medicine at Kyiv University before switching to literature. He moved to Moscow, writing Russian language classics like The Master and Margarita and Heart of a Dog. Bulgakov's contemporary Akhmatova was born in Odessa, attending Kyiv higher courses for women and Kyiv University's law faculty. In 1910, Akhmatova moved to St. Petersburg, gaining fame as a poet. She was later hailed as the moon of Russian poetry. These 3 writers' experiences show that although born and raised in Ukraine, they had to go to Russia to achieve prominence. Their writing styles and lifestyles became completely Russified, From annexation onward, many Ukrainian elites sought independence, though not all Ukrainians willingly became Russian. In 1825, some Russian officers launched an uprising, historically called the Decembrist Revolt. A Ukrainian officer joined them, seeking constitutional monarchy to improve Ukraine's situation. Sadly, the revolt was crushed, shattering hopes. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom, ostensibly liberating serfs. But landlords seized most land, forcing freed serfs to farm for them, fueling Ukrainian resistance. To inspire hope, nationalist Pavlo Chubinsky wrote, "Ukraine has not yet perished," singing, "Ukraine's glory and freedom still endure. Compatriots, we shall rule our own land." This song spread widely and later became Ukraine's anthem. To erase Ukrainian identity, the Tsar banned Ukrainian publications, including textbooks, and public performances in Ukrainian. The theater ban lasted over 20 years, devastating Ukrainian culture and deeply wounding national pride. In the 20th century, Ukrainian uprisings surged repeatedly, all ultimately suppressed. Clearly, Ukrainians alone couldn't overthrow Tsarist rule. Then, major geopolitical shifts gave Ukrainians an opportunity. World War I erupted in 1914. Tsarist Russia joined the Allies against Germany and Austria-Hungary. After 3 years of defeats, Russia's economy collapsed. Social crisis exploded. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending the Russian Empire. With Russians overwhelmed, Ukrainians saw their chance. So Ukrainian political parties and social groups established the Central Rada, a parliament declaring high autonomy. Meanwhile, 300,000 Ukrainian Russian soldiers pledged allegiance to the Rada, giving Ukrainians confidence to pursue full independence. But this dream soon vanished. This happened because after the October Revolution, the Central Rada was forcibly dissolved. In late 1917, with Bolshevik help, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was established. In 1922, Ukraine joined the USSR as a constituent republic, once again bound to Russia. My narrative now moves to part 5, a mix of joy and sorrow, Europe's grain basket through trials. From 1922 to 1991, the USSR lasted about 70 years. Ukraine's relationship with it can be summed up in 8 words: joy mixed with sorrow, ending in separation. First, the mix of joy and sorrow. Due to blindly pushing agricultural collectivization without regard for reality, combined with natural disasters, Ukraine, known as Europe's breadbasket, suffered famine from 1932 to 1934. Statistics show nearly 4 million deaths. 1 in 8 people starved. In subsequent political purges, 270,000 Ukrainians were arrested, half executed, suffering losses second only to Russia. But worse was yet to come. In June 1941, the Soviet-German War erupted. Nazi Germany and allies invaded with 3.8 million troops, the Southern Army targeting Ukraine. Unprepared Soviet forces collapsed en masse. Within 3 weeks, Germans advanced 600 kilometers, encircling Kyiv. Soviet High Command delayed retreat orders, resulting in 660,000 soldiers captured. The Battle of Kyiv became history's bloodiest encirclement. By late 1941, Soviets abandoned nearly all Ukraine. Initially, some Ukrainian nationalists naively hoped Nazis would help them achieve independence, but quickly realized their mistake. Nazis only wanted Ukrainian grain and coal, viewing Ukrainians as subhumans. Per Hitler's plan, these inferior races were to be exterminated to create living space for Germans. Under Nazi occupation, Ukrainian civilians were massacred en masse. Jews suffered near total extermination. According to statistics, during World War II, the Nazis slaughtered 6 million Jews, 1 million from Ukraine alone. Yet in this suffocating darkness, humanity's brilliance still shone through. Ukrainian Catholic priest Andriy Sheptytsky hid hundreds of Jews in monasteries at enormous risk. Nazis enforced a brutal rule in Ukraine. Rescue Jews face family extermination. There were many Ukrainians like Sheptytsky.
After World War II, Israel documented rescue stories worldwide, listing helpers as righteous among the nations.
To date, 2,500 Ukrainian citizens are on this list, earning global Jewish gratitude. Ukrainians also made outstanding contributions to the Soviet war effort.
Over 7 million Ukrainians enlisted during the war, 20% of Soviet forces.
Ukrainian soldiers fought prominently in key War II battles: Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. World War II cost Ukraine 7 million deaths, 18 million displaced, and 700 towns plus 28,000 villages destroyed.
Ukraine lost 40% of its wealth and 80% of industrial and agricultural equipment.
Post-war poverty soon brought famine to rural Ukraine, killing nearly 1 million. Fortunately, by the mid-1950s, Ukrainians' lives gradually improved. In 1953, Khrushchev became Soviet Communist Party first secretary, implementing reforms that boosted the economy. Crucially, Khrushchev grew up in Ukraine and launched his political career there. He always saw Ukraine as his power base. After taking power, Khrushchev vigorously promoted Ukrainian cadres into Soviet leadership. Thus, Ukrainian elites gained influence over central decisions, and Ukraine secured more internal autonomy.
In 1954, Khrushchev transferred Crimea, then Russian territory, to Ukraine, citing Ukrainian help to revive Crimea's economy.
Khrushchev never imagined that 60 years later, Ukraine and Russia would feud endlessly over Crimea. In 1964, Khrushchev was ousted. However, new leader Leonid Brezhnev also hailed from Ukraine, continuing the tradition of promoting Ukrainian cadres. So, even during Brezhnev's economic stagnation, Ukrainian elites had connections in Moscow. Life wasn't bad. The shift came in the mid to late 1980s. In 1985, Gorbachev became the Soviet Union's supreme leader. He had little connection to Ukraine. Once in power, Ukrainian cadres faced cold shoulders and purges from high positions. This alienated elites, while Gorbachev's new thinking policies opened media, sparking Ukrainian independence ideas. This sentiment peaked after a catastrophic event. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear plant exploded just 113 kilometers from Kyiv. Disaster response required Moscow's approval. Local leaders had no say. This delayed relief efforts, worsening the catastrophe. About 50 million curies of radiation were released, equivalent to 500 Hiroshima atomic bombs. Over 50,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian land was contaminated, larger than Belgium, 2,300 settlements and 3 million people directly affected, 30 million threatened. Facing this crisis, Soviet leaders still ordered May Day parades to proceed, ignoring Ukrainian safety. This enraged all Ukrainians. Calls to leave the USSR and seek independence surged. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union itself teetered on collapse. First, Eastern Europe upheaved. Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany broke free from Soviet control. Then the Baltic states declared independence, further inspiring Ukrainians. In December 1991, Ukraine held a referendum. Over 90% supported independence. Even Crimea, with a Russian majority, voted over 50% for independence.
Finally, mediated by the U.S., Ukraine signed agreements with Russia and Belarus, forming the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS.
Why did the U.S. intervene? Because the USSR had stationed nuclear weapons in these republics.
Americans feared nuclear weapons would go uncontrolled if the USSR collapsed.
They hoped the CIS would let nations negotiate a solution. The CIS's birth declared the Soviet Union dead. In late 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation as supreme leader. The Soviet Union dissolved. From the Cossacks' oath to the Tsar in 1654 to Ukraine's independence in 1991, through 330-plus years of struggle, Ukrainians finally achieved their nationhood dream. Of course, nationhood didn't mean true independence. After centuries of Russian rule, Ukraine remained deeply influenced. Achieving genuine autonomy in culture and economics
Would require a long journey ahead.
So Ukraine implemented measures summarized as actively de-Russifying while embracing the European family. In 1994, Ukraine signed agreements with Western nations, relinquishing Soviet-inherited nuclear weapons to become non-nuclear, signaling Western integration.
In 1997, Ukraine signed a NATO partnership charter, edging toward membership.
Simultaneously, it settled territorial disputes with Russia, securing borders. Cultural revival momentum. Ukrainian became the official language. Ukrainian language books, media, songs, and films received state support. Ukrainians emphasized unique traditions to distinguish from Russian culture. Economically, Ukraine charted an initially low but rising trajectory. Early independence saw state assets plundered by oligarchs amid rampant corruption. Over half of enterprises operated at loss. Unemployment and inflation soared. Living standards plummeted. Sobering demographic reality. Statistics show a 5% population decline in a decade. Mass talent drained to West or Russia. In 1999, economist Viktor Yushchenko became prime minister, later president. He strengthened rule of law, cracked down on corruption, reduced SME taxes, and advanced market reforms, sparking private sector growth. Meanwhile, Ukraine's coal and steel industries gradually revived. Mass exports-driven optimism, plus crops long favored by Europe or America, greatly boosted the economy. By 2000, Ukraine's GDP grew 6%, sustaining momentum for a decade. The economy rebounded. Talent returned. Today, Ukraine is Central Eastern Europe's software engineering hub. Everything seems headed toward brighter horizons. However, a social crisis was brewing. Russians still made up 20% of Ukraine's population, especially in Crimea, where they exceeded 58%, twice the Ukrainian population. The Ukrainian government's de-Russification policies had long fueled their discontent. Meanwhile, Russia grew deeply concerned about Ukraine's foreign policy.
To Russia, Ukraine was right on its doorstep. If it fully aligned with the West, Russia's national security would be severely threatened. Thus, under Russian influence, pro-Russian factions emerged in Ukrainian politics to counter pro-Western factions, advocating European immigration.
In 2010, pro-Russian politician Viktor Yanukovych became president, implementing pro-Russian policies.
He also refused to sign a free trade agreement with Europe, sparking fierce pro-Western backlash that ultimately toppled Yanukovych and restored pro-European leadership.
This triggered protests in eastern Ukraine. Ethnic Russians in Donetsk and Crimea even organized armed resistance groups. Ukraine's government cracked down, prompting immediate Russian action. In February 2014, Russia forcibly seized Crimea under the pretext of protecting ethnic Russians, then approved its independence and annexation into Russia. Ukraine refused to recognize this but remains powerless to reclaim Crimea to this day. Crimea remains Ukraine's unhealed wound, and the Ukraine-Russia conflict endures. Yet the author notes modern Ukrainians share a unified national identity. Despite hardships ahead, they'll never again be enslaved by empires. All right, that concludes The Gates of Europe, Ukraine's 2,000-year history. Reading notes are below the audio. We'll see you next time.